Jane Eyre clearly recalls two or three different fairy tales. The first one that you probably already noticed in the Gateshead section in the beginning of the book would be Cinderella. Mrs. Reed is the wicked stepmother. Eliza and Georgiana are the nasty stepsisters. Jane is the poor put upon Cinderella. She's feistier and angrier than Cinderella, but still the basic structure is the same. When she moves on to Thornfield Hall, the dominant parallel fairy tale is Beauty and the Beast, and this is really the probably most important parallel of the two. There are all these interesting ways in which the love story of Beauty and the Beast and the love story of Jane and Rochester parallel one another. There's the Disney Beauty and the Beast. This is my favorite Beauty and the Beast, which is the 1946 Jean Cocteau version. So let's look at some of these descriptions of Thornfield and see how they fit in with the Gothic tradition. When Jane first arrives, this is what she says. The steps and banisters were of oak, the staircase window was high and latticed. Both it and the long gallery into which the bedroom doors opened looked as if they belonged to a church rather than a house. So latticed windows have that kind of stained glass quality that manipulate light. It looked as if they belonged to a church. So she explicitly says this Gothic space is sort of like Gothic church architecture. A very chill and vault-like air pervaded the stairs. So it's like a tomb, it's like a church, suggesting cheerless ideas of space and solitude. And I was glad when I finally ushered into my chamber. Cheerless ideas of space and solitude. She's this small person in this big, scary, empty church-like space. Here's a scene from Beauty and the Beast. You recognize the grotesque Gothic carvings, the small amount of light in darkness. I particularly like this one down here. This is an early study for Beauty and the Beast. It's very simple for the Disney Beauty and the Beast. It's very simple, but it's a very good example of how Gothic manipulates light and darkness in the same way that Gothic church architecture does. So you have the heroine there, and she's alone in this big, dark, cheerless, empty space of solitude, and all she has is the one little light to move her through the shadows. This is Haddon Hall, which is used in the most recent film version of Jane Eyre. It gives you a sense of the sort of she describes it as a gentleman's manor house, not a nobleman's seat, with battlements round the top. So Haddon House really is sort of a nobleman's seat. It's a little grander than Thornfield Hall probably really was. There are a couple different candidates for the real Thornfield Hall. This is one, North Lees Hall, and this is the other. This is the other here, Norton Conyers Hall. They sort of look more modest than we want to imagine Thornfield Hall, and since it's a work of fiction, let's imagine it as looking like Haddon Hall. It's important to sort of get a sense that Jane is dwarfed by the grandeur of this place. She just says that everything is stately and imposing. She's a small person in a big, dark, complicated, frightening Gothic space. As Jane moves through Thornfield, she encounters all sorts of different versions of the fantasy interior. This is actually a pretty happy one. Mrs. Fairfax is leading Jane through after she first arrived, and Jane says she pointed to a wide arch corresponding to the window and hung like it with a Tyrian-dyed curtain, now looped up. Mounting to it by two broad steps and looking through, I thought I caught a glimpse of a fairy palace. So bright to my novice eyes appeared the view beyond. Yet it was merely a very pretty drawing room. And I've given you the purple and brown again to suggest fantasy, irrational fantasy Jane and then rational Jane. She looks and she has this predisposition to interpret everything as a fantasy landscape, as a fantasy interior. I thought I caught a glimpse of a fairy place, she says. Then she corrects herself and says, yet it was merely a very pretty drawing room. So she looks at something like this, and she imagines something like this. Jane is always predisposed to translate things into their fantasy version. It's very much like how the Romantics look at Mont Blanc and they don't just see a mountain. They see a fantastical city full of spires and strange palaces. In the same way, she just looks into a pretty drawing room and she sees a fairy place. As Jane walks around this dark space, she imagines it as fantastical. Now, the thing about Beauty and the Beast is that Beauty moves through the castle, which actually is an enchanted castle. As you remember, all of the people have been turned into furniture or objects. In the Jean Cocteau version, they do this really weird thing where they actually have body parts as the furniture. See here, you see the arms are sconces, and here you've got a hand holding up the candles, which makes the enchanted quality of the architecture all the more terrifying. But oh, here's somebody's done a Sims version of Thornfield Hall, so you can go online. I actually find it a little disappointing. This, for example, is the secret room on the third floor, which ought to be dark, creepy, and terrifying, and just looks like a sort of nice hotel suite. The third floor is the most gothic and frightening place in Thornfield Hall, which is sort of interesting because typically in a palace you'd go into the dungeons, to find the darkest place, the place of imprisonment, the place of secrets and secret rooms. Here it's on the third floor, and this is how Jane describes. Here it's on the third floor, and this is how Jane describes it. The imperfect light entering by the narrow casement showed bedsteads of 100 years old. So again with the light, it's always imperfect light. It's always the manipulation of light within overwhelming darkness in Gothic. Chests in oak or walnut, looking with their strange carvings of palm branches and cherubs' heads like types of the Hebrew Ark. So the Hebrew Ark from the Bible is this holy object. She sees this in sort of mystical, quasi-religious terms as ancient mystical objects. Everything looks antiquated, she says. They looked like they had been made by fingers that for 2 generations had been coffin dust, so it's a place of death. All these relics, another religious word, suggesting a holy object of antiquity.